Welcome to episode 137 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Lost Guy. It's March 17, 1971, and today's story is about a football match that stopped being football. Because on this day in 1971, Boca Juniors and Sporting Cristal turned a Copa Libertadores group game at La Bombonera into one of the ugliest nights in the history of the competition. 19 players were sent off. Not 9, not 10, but 19. Only 3 stayed on the pitch without seeing red. And if that sounds like parody, it wasn't. It was Libertadores in one of its darkest moods. The crowd boiling, the match tied, the stakes high and the violence already in the air, and then one spark turning the whole thing into a public brawl, a police case, and a diplomatic problem between two countries. This is one of those nights that explains why South American football, for all its beauty and genius, also built a reputation for something else in the 1960s and 70s. Not just edge, not just intimidation, but outright menace. As we touched on way back in episode 4, with the Battle of Montevideo in 1967, that period produced nights when the line between hard football and outright violence simply disappeared. And March 17, 1971 belongs in that same gallery, maybe even at the very center of it. How did we get here? To understand this match, you have to understand the Copa Libertadores of that era. The tournament was still young, only a decade old, but it had already developed a fierce identity. Travel was long, officiating was controversial, crowds were hostile, and matches often felt much more than sport. They were about national prestige, masculine pride, club identity, and the refusal to back down. That atmosphere helped make Libertadores compelling, but it also helped make it combustible. South American football in those years could produce brilliant teams, brilliant players, and brilliant tactical ideas. It could also produce matches that looked less like contests and more like grudges acted out in public. The competition's mythology was being built by both forces at once, and Boca Juniors were a perfect club for that setting. La Bombonera was already one of football's most intimidating grounds, steep, loud, claustrophobic, and tribal. A stadium that seemed to lean onto the pitch. Boca themselves were not yet the Sierra Libertadores champions they would later become, but they were already one of the continent's biggest institutions, one of the clubs most able to turn a match into an ordeal. Sporting Cristal came from a different football tradition, but not from nowhere. By 1971, they were already one of Peru's strongest clubs, recent league champions, modern, ambitious, and technically strong. Their pairing with Boca and Rosario Central in Group 1, alongside Universitario, gave the group a particularly volatile mix. 2 Argentine clubs, 2 Peruvian clubs, and 1 semi-final place left open behind holders, Estudiantes. And the group was tight, very tight. All 4 teams had won 1, drawn 1, and lost 1. Everything was still in play. The final stretch would be decided by 5 matches, 4 of them in Argentina, with only 1 place available in the semi-finals. That is not just tension, that is a breeding ground for paranoia. There was already bad blood too. On March 1st, Sporting Cristal had beaten Boca 2-0 in Lima. So Boca came into the return match under pressure, and knowing that anything less than a win could leave them in deep trouble. The night before, Universitario had drawn in Rosario, which made the group even more open going into Boca against Cristal. So when the teams walked out at La Bombonera on March 17, the game already carried more heat than a normal group stage fixture should. And then the football began. In front of around 60,000 at La Bombonera, Cristal struck first. Juan Obregoso scored in the 17th minute, but Boca reacted quickly. Jorge Koch equalized on 22 minutes. Angel Clemente Rojas made it 2-1 on 24. At that point, Boca were where they needed to be, in front, in control of their own fate, and with the stadium fully alive. But Sporting Cristal did not disappear. They stayed in the game, and in the 69th minute, Carlos Gonzalez Pajuelo made it 2-2 after Boca goalkeeper Ruben Sanchez spilled the ball. That goal changed everything, not just the scoreboard, but the mood. Now Boca needed more. Now the crowd grew harsher. Now every challenge mattered more, and now every appeal felt loaded. And then came the sequence that pushed the match over the edge. With only a few minutes left, Boca attacked again. Roberto Rogel went down in the area. Boca demanded a penalty, but Uruguayan referee Alejandro Otero said no. From there, the details vary a little depending on the source, but the broad line is the same. Boca's fury boiled over. Ruben Suñé, Boca's captain, lashed out in the next phase of play. Some accounts say he hacked down Alfredo Quesada. Others placed the initial confrontation on Alberto Gallardo. Either way, the denied penalty and the immediate retaliation lit the fuse. And once it was lit, the match was gone. What followed was not one fight, it was several. Players punched, players kicked. One of Boca's men tore up a corner flag and used it in the melee. Gallardo struck back and opened a wound on Suñé's face that required 7 stitches. Jorge Koch kicked Eloy Campos and Fernando Milan while they were down, leaving Campos with a broken nose and Milan with a concussion. Elsewhere, players chased one another in packs. Referee Otero, instead of fleeing immediately, stayed in the middle of the madness and started sending men off one after another. By the time it ended, Otero had shown red 19 times. The only 3 players not sent off were Boca goalkeeper Ruben Sanchez, Sporting Cristal goalkeeper Luis Rubiños, and Boca defender Julio Melendez, a Peruvian playing for Boca, which gives the whole thing one more strange historical twist. Everyone else was gone. The score was officially left as a suspended 2-2, but the match itself had become secondary. This was now a public order event. Police entered. The 2 injured Peruvians were hospitalized for treatment. Then get this. Argentina at the time had an edict allowing arrest after major sporting disorder, so the expelled players, except for the 2 injured Peruvians, were taken to a police station near La Bombonera and spent the night there. So 17 ended up in the cell. And by the next day, after diplomatic pressure and intervention from Peruvian and Argentine officials, they were released. That is what makes this episode bigger than a football scandal. It moved beyond the stadium almost instantly. The players were not just suspended, they were detained. And the press in both countries exploded. The Peruvian embassy in Buenos Aires became involved. And what had started as a group match in the Copa Libertadores became part of a wider argument about violence, nationalism, and what South American football had allowed itself to become. So what did it change? Immediately it wrecked Boca's campaign. CONMEBOL awarded the points from the abandoned match to Sporting Cristal. Boca then refused to fulfill the remaining 2 fixtures against Universitario and Rosario Central. Those matches were awarded to their opponents. Universitario benefited most and went through to the semi-finals. For Boca, the tournament was effectively over in disgrace. There were also sanctions. Players and officials on both sides were punished. La Bombonera was closed, and Boca president Alberto Armando publicly said he was ashamed, calling for the harshest punishment possible. That reaction matters because even within a culture accustomed to violent matches, this had crossed the line. Sporting Cristal's aftermath was more complicated. In Peru, the team returned to a hero's welcome, but heroism is not the same as benefit. The club came out of Buenos Aires battered, suspended, and weakened. Forced to rely on reserves and youth players, they lost heavily in the remaining matches and went out too. So nobody truly profited on the pitch from the chaos itself, even if the table eventually favored Universitario. And then there's a deeper point. This match did not stand alone. That is what makes it so important. It belonged to a larger South American football culture of the era, in which intimidation was strategic, crowd pressure was expected, and referees often seemed to be managing public unrest as much as a game. That doesn't mean every Libertadores match was a riot, of course not. But enough were poisoned by this atmosphere that the competition carried the stigma with it, especially abroad. The Intercontinental Cup clashes of the late 1960s and early 70s had already done damage to South American football's image in Europe. The Battle of La Bombonera confirmed that the problem was not a one-off. And even decades later, the region never fully escaped that inheritance. Boca's semi-final against Colo-Colo in 1991 ended with invasion, violence, arrests, and another major scar in the tournament's memory. Different teams, different era, same old pattern waiting underneath. So the larger lesson is uncomfortable. Libertadores built parts of its mythology on fire, on hostility, on the idea that a trip through certain grounds had to feel dangerous, not merely difficult. That atmosphere gave the tournament edge and legend. It also gave it nights like this one, where football lost control of itself entirely. And maybe that's the best way to understand March 17, 1971, not as an absurd red card record, not just as Boca's shame, and not only as Sporting Cristal's ordeal, but as the night Libertadores collided with the logic of the street, the police station, the diplomatic cable, and the newspaper front page, and showed just how thin the boundary had become between a continental football match and a public brawl. Before we go, 3 things to take away from March 17, 1971. First, the 19 send-offs are the headline, but the real story is that the match spilled beyond football almost immediately, into hospitals, police cells, and international relations. Second, only 3 players escaped dismissal, the 2 goalkeepers and Julio Melendez, which tells you just how total the collapse was. And third, the Battle of La Bombonera was not an isolated madness. It was one of the clearest expressions of a wider football culture in the region that took years, and perhaps decades, to begin leaving behind. On this day in 1971, Boca Juniors and Sporting Cristal turned a Copa Libertadores group match at La Bombonera into one of the most infamous nights in football history. The 19 players sent off, most of them arrested, and the competition itself forced to reckon with the violence it had helped normalize. That's all for episode 137 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Lost Guy. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the show, leave a rating, and share it with a friend. Tomorrow, we go to March 18, 1909, to one of football governance's forgotten detours, the founding of a short-lived rival to FIFA, proof that even at the top of the sport, authority was never as settled as it later came to seem. See you tomorrow.